Everyone, welcome back to the second channel. My name is Tom and I just got back from Project Hail Mary.
It's now or never.
I was looking forward to this movie. I read the book, which I liked, even if I had some hesitations about it. But even so, I thought it would be a fun movie, or it had the potential to be a fun movie. And I think that's largely what it was. For starters, I think it was very well made. The production design, the cinematography, all that was just impeccable. Greg Fraser, who did the cinematography, is very good at his job, and the movie felt very tactile. It felt very real, very timeless also, in the sense that it invoked, older, more classic space movies. Reminded me also of Interstellar in some parts, where they would attach like cameras to the space stations so that it looks like it's kind of like a GoPro setup that's going on, which adds to the realism instead of just having like the camera omnisciently floating around in space. I also enjoyed the overall story. I thought it was engaging, and I liked the structure of the character arc that this movie has. I'm just gonna jump straight into spoilers, but we start with Ryan Gosling's character Ryland, I think it was. Ryland Grace, who finds himself on this space station without memory. He doesn't know who he is or how he got there or what he's supposed to do. He quickly figures out that he has to save the planet from this sun-eating bacteria or something like it, some sort of miniature, like minuscule alien that's threatening the survival of our species. And then along the way we get these flashbacks that kind of, it's not super clearly communicated, but it's kind of, as we're seeing the flashbacks, it's kind of implied that that's also Ryland remembering what's going on. So the information that we're getting through these flashbacks, it's also like him sort of slowly regaining his notions of who he was, how he got to where he is now, and so on. And what I liked about this structure is the way it kind of clicks into place in the end, where you get this story of a man who's stranded in space, who becomes this heroic figure, trying to save humanity basically, but then at the end of the flashbacks we figure out that he was actually he had declined to go on this mission because it was basically a suicide mission, and he didn't feel like he had the courage for it, and they basically kidnapped him or abducted him and sent him into space against his will. And the reason I liked it is because it just shows very clearly how much Grace was kind of getting in his own way. He thought he wasn't this kind of heroic person. He had all these conceptions about himself, and it's only when he kind of had those conceptions stripped away from him that there was a kind of heroic essence to his character. So, it's a nice way of communicating how we can get in our own way and how we can sort of limit ourselves and limit the beliefs we have about ourselves in terms of like heroic purpose or heroic capacity, and that we can actually be more heroic, more self-sacrificial, and that we can serve a greater purpose for humanity and those around us. And I think the movie did that quite well, especially in combination with the friendship that develops with Rocky, which is of course the alien from the book, and who's basically on the same mission as Ryland Grace is, but from a different universe or different solar system where his own planet is also threatened. And it's through the bond that forms between them that Ryland also learns to form a connection that he maybe was afraid to make back on Earth, back with the conceptions about himself, about who he was.
Fist my bum. No, it's fist bump.
So yeah, that was basically my main takeaway from this movie based on the first viewing, in terms of what the story is doing, what it's about, what the character journey is in very general terms. And having said that, I also have a few negatives. Mainly that, for me personally, to my own sort of sensibilities and what I enjoy, this movie was just way too Marvel coded for me. Like, it was just, I get that maybe this was going for more of a pure comedy as opposed to something like Interstellar or Arrival or even The Martian. But it was just too much for me. It was just undercutting, both like the emotional moments where especially at the end where the first time Rocky and Grace, they say goodbye to each other and they have this kind of poignant moment where they do like the gestures, and then Ryan Gosling, he turns around and he has to make a few more like funny ones. I felt like just with every scene the movie was sort of desperate for you to like it, like as if they couldn't let any other emotion other than just got sort of like a levity, they just couldn't let it breathe on its own. Also just the moments of wonder. There's a great sequence where they get closer to like another planet, and it's this beautiful color scheme, and Greg Fraser really firing on all cylinders. And it could have been this moment of pure like awe and wonder, as reminiscent of movies such as Sunshine, which did that very well. But even there, it's undercut with Rocky coming in and like, what are you doing, Grace? And then Ryan Gosling is like, oh, I'm having a moment. Like, you don't need to sort of explicitly verbalize that. Just let us be in the moment. You don't have to say you're having a moment while you're having it. It just undercuts the emotion of it, and it was just too much for me throughout like the whole movie, and it just kept me from, or it prevented me from being like fully immersed in it. It feels like insecure in some ways on part of the filmmakers. Like, I don't think it's necessarily Ryan Gosling's fault. I think he's a great actor. He can be a serious actor. He can be a funny actor. But I do feel like in the context of this movie, it just felt way too, almost more like Ryan Reynolds. And it was just too much for me on that scale between serious and Ryan Reynolds, which is just like more like a total farce and satire. And you could have replaced Ryan Gosling here for the most part with like Star-Lord or like Thor in the later, the more funny movies that he's in, and it wouldn't have felt out of place in terms of how the character behaves. And I don't mind him being that kind of character. Like, I don't mind the main character being like a funny character or a comedic character. But I think the problem is that the direction of his character didn't always feel true to the character itself. And what I mean by that is, like, I feel like, it's fair for Ryan Gosling to be this character who's kind of awkward around people and then uses humor as like a coping mechanism. That's kind of what his character was, right? He's constantly just quipping out of self-defense and not maybe wanting to let other people in close, or not wanting to like face the gravity of some certain situations, not wanting to face the gravity of the danger that he's in, which also in the end prevents him from kind of stepping up. But the thing is, he also acts this way when he's just totally alone in the spacecraft, and there's no one around. He's still like performing for no one, and that's not exactly true. But then it just feels like he's just performing for the audience, and in those moments it feels more like the directors are talking through Ryan to the audience and are like pleading for you to stay engaged, and and it just feels like they're just constantly trying to make him sort of iconic or memeable or just funny or likable, instead of just letting him be true to the character that he's in. At one point he's just walking around in all these funny, like goofy outfits when he's all alone on the ship. And, maybe other people will feel differently about it, but for me, that's just like, that doesn't feel like an honest, emotional human reality. That doesn't feel like it captures at all like his desperation or even his sense of defeat in the face of what he's going through. It just feels like, the filmmakers are trying to be funny, or the filmmakers are trying to get a response out of the audience. And, it made me feel like I could feel like the puppet master's strings in those sequences. And it was just too much. Again, I'm going to say this a couple more times probably, but for me, the humor, the comedy of it all could have easily been dialed back with 60%, and it would have struck a much better balance. Because also when Rocky comes into play, there's also these moments of funny miscommunication where they'll like do a fist bump, and then Rocky afterwards is like, oh, fist my bump, which is not the thing, but it's kind of funny. And I wouldn't have minded some of those things, but they just way overdid it. And in this sense, I think The Martian struck a much better balance in terms of balancing seriousness and self-seriousness with also a levity of tone. And in that movie you had Matt Damon going like, oh, I'm gonna science the shit out of this or something like that. And but he was doing that, I think, if I remember correctly, like in the context of he was self-recording himself potentially for others to find later or for someone to find. So it would make sense that there's a kind of performative element there, that he's trying to sort of put on a brave face for the camera. But in Hail Mary, I feel like there were a lot of situations where that just wasn't the case, and the movie was just being fun and quirky for the sake of itself, and for just out of fear that the audience would take anything too seriously, which, to some extent you can argue that's fine, and you can argue that this was never going to be the next Interstellar or the next Arrival or even the next Martian, but that it just wanted to be more of a pure comedy. But for me personally, that just also means, like, if you're gonna insist on this kind of lightheartedness, this kind of levity in every facet of the movie, then that's just gonna come at the expense of my depth of immersion. That means that I'm only gonna get invested so far, and will only like have that amount of an emotional experience.
The consensus here is that it would be preferable if you did not die.
Thanks, guys.
There's some other minor issues that I have, mainly because of this, because of the insistence of being like fun and breezy throughout, is that it just doesn't set up the stakes as well as it could have. Like, I never got the feeling that there really is this impending annihilation of humanity that's about to happen, even though they kind of repeat it over and over again through the dialogue. The emotion of it just doesn't land, and that's because it's kind of refracted through Ryan Gosling being in denial, which, I guess makes sense because you're associating yourself with the main character, and so you're feeling what he's feeling. But then again, I feel like there must have been like some kind of deeper subconscious dread that goes on even in Ryan Gosling's character that we just weren't able to access because of the way they filmed it now. I also felt like it just went on a bit too long, especially at the end. It feels like there's this big climax, and then there's a finale, and you feel like, okay, now we're gonna go home. And then there's another beat that happens, and that kind of instills a sort of second finale. If you know, I guess we're into spoilers already, so I can just tell you it's the bit where, they say goodbye, they go their separate ways, and then Ryan has to go back to save Rocky because the predator bacteria that they found that's going to save everything, they were leaking from the ship or something like it. And I understand that was a necessary story beat because it demonstrates that Ryan Gosling has finally sort of completed his character arc, because now he's sacrificing himself, which is the thing that he couldn't do earlier, to save Rocky. So, that shows character growth. That's necessary for the story's completion. But still, now it does still feel like the story has two finales, and I'm not sure how else they could have done it, but I'm sure there must have been some way to kind of streamline that a little bit more into something that feels a little bit more straightforward, instead of kind of backtracking on itself as it does now. So yeah, that's pretty much my first impression of this movie. I still liked it. I would give it like 3 out of 5 stars or something like it. I think it was a fun movie, but for me it doesn't, especially compared to what some of the other people are saying and some of the early reactions, which are much more like to the movie's favor. Like, I was slightly disappointed that I wasn't getting something that had a little bit more oomph, something more for me to chew on, some deeper themes, because I do like the story that we have with Ryan Gosling learning to self-sacrifice, learning to become more of a heroic character and get out of his own way. I liked the relationship, the bond between him and Rocky, which was, by the way, I didn't mention this before, but I think he was very well designed. It seemed like they did a lot of practical effects there. I think that was very well done. Again, from production standpoint, this movie was incredible. But also, I do feel like there weren't just too many like deeper themes to sort of dig into or to kind of think about more after the movie was over. Like, I had some notes where I said, like, it feels like Interstellar without the depth of emotion, Arrival without a real interest in the human condition, and sunshine without the true cultivation of awe and wonder. And again, I do like what we got with the bonding between the alien and Gosling and his character, but it is a kind of like childlike story almost. And you know, maybe if you see the movie like this as more of a movie that's aimed for like a younger audience than the audience for like an Interstellar or Arrival, then I think this movie is going to be a lot of fun. But if you want like a more serious, grown-up adult story that has like actual themes and more complex emotions and character stuff going on, like movies such as Interstellar or Arrival or Sunshine, then I do think you might end up slightly disappointed as I did. But you know, it was still fun, so I would recommend you going to see it for yourself. And yeah, let me know what you think.